Today's lecture is all about the Italian Renaissance. And first of all, we need to take a look at the word itself. The name Renaissance translates from the Italian word rinascimento, which means rebirth. And that's exactly what the Renaissance is. It's a rebirth of knowledge and learning as civilization emerges from the Dark Ages. So normally in art history, we have this ebb and flow of artistic creation. We start in the prehistory and early civilizations, working our way up to the classical age, the Greeks and Romans, and then we fall into the Dark or Middle Ages after the fall of Rome. And here we're reaching a second summit, which will be the Renaissance. This is an amazing time in the development not only of the arts, but also of sciences and politics. So we need to know when the Renaissance occurred. And for rough years, we're basically looking from the year 1300 to the year 1600. And each century is broken down into specific areas. So in the 1300s, we have the Trecento period. This is the early Renaissance. In the 1400s, we have the Quattrocento, the middle Renaissance. And finally, the 1500s, this is the late or high Renaissance. We also need to take a look at where the Renaissance occurred. And of course, this is an event that occurred throughout Europe, also up in England. But the most incredible work emerges from Italy, and that's where we spend most of our time. We're going to start off in the city of Padua, which is in the kind of upper right-hand side of the screen, kind of near Venice. In the 1400s, we're going to be moving down to the Republic of Florence. In the 1500s, we move to the Papal States in Rome. And then after the sack of Rome in the 1520s, the last vestiges of the Renaissance occurs in Venice. So think about the people who are involved with this time period. This is an era where some of the greatest individuals to have ever walked the earth are living and working. These are people like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, the sculptor Donatello. So we've covered all the Ninja Turtles, right? They're all present here. We also have the painter Botticelli, Martin Luther, Machiavelli, Christopher Columbus, and also our friend Galileo, all present and working during this time. So a lot of people think it is such a wonderful time that they want to go back to the Renaissance, and that is a bad idea. During the Renaissance age, it is amazing as much was created as it was, because Europe did not exist as it does today. There's not a unified political system. Italy is comprised of a loose association of city-states. Maybe they spoke the same dialect, but that's as close as they get to being friends. This is a male-dominated society. We have religious persecution, warfare, famines, floods, and disease. Now, the worst disease is the plague. And the plague is going to strike several times during the Renaissance, about every 10 years, in fact. But once a century, there is a huge outbreak, such as happened in 1348, where over half of the population of Europe died from the plague. In Florence, it is much worse. Nearly 80% of that city's population was killed. And this is an artwork that deals exactly with the plague. In the bottom left-hand corner, you see people in coffins that have died from the plague, and those that are on horseback just to the right of the coffins, they're holding like handkerchiefs in front of their mouths. In the very center of this painting, there are two angels holding a scroll, letting us know that the church is the way to salvation. And here's a detailed image of what we were just talking about. Unfortunately, this image is on the wall of the Campo Santo, and it caught fire. and the paint literally melted off of the wall. This is a fresco painting. It is the paint is embedded into the plaster of the wall, but it got so hot because the rooftop here was metal, and it fell down onto the walls and it melted the plaster. It has gone through major restoration. There's still some work to do, but you can see how incredibly beautiful it's been restored. So we're going to start with the early Renaissance. And this is the Trecento period. This is the 1300s. And we're going to be taking a look at a couple of altarpieces. The first one here is the Madonna and Child Enthroned by Cimabue. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how an altarpiece is created, because we're going to see a lot of these throughout the Renaissance age. First of all, you need to know that they're pretty tall, normally between 10 and 12 feet. We're going to start off by having this created on wood. We're not using canvas at this time for painting, so normally this is poplar wood. It needs to be coated with a priming agent, such as gesso, which is a mixture of chalk and glue or plaster and glue. It provides a smooth painting surface, and it also provides some reflectivity as well. Level C is an underdrawing of the main figures and objects. Then gold leaf is applied, usually around the backdrop or around the heads of those of the religious figures. Then we have a grisaille or gray value that's added, so we know how light or how dark something is going to be painted. And then the completed painting is done using tempera paint. We're using tempera because oil paint has not been invented yet. So tempera is created from pigment and egg yolk, and again, oil paint has not been invented at this time. We're going to compare Cimabue's artwork with this one by Giotto, and this is also called the Madonna and Child Enthroned. And when we look at one next to the other, even though they're completed about 20 years apart, they're vastly different in terms of technique and style. The work at the left is considered Gothic or late medieval ages. Cimabue is the last of the Byzantine artists. The work is very flat, it's very frontal. When we look at the angels, they're kind of stacked one on top of the other. They're looking this way and that. The Madonna herself looks like she might slide off of the throne. We're also, at the bottom of the painting, we have these apostles that are kind of blocking our access to the Madonna. The work at the right by Giotto gives us a lot more believable space. There's a lot more figures in this painting to the right, but there's also a lot more room for them. We have access to the Madonna. She can step down to us, or we can walk up to her. And you'll notice the idea of line of sight. Everyone is focused on her. She has a much more believable body, and again, it's a much more believable space in the work at the right. We ascribe the term mimesis to this painting, and mimesis means to replicate or to reproduce, and the focus of that is nature. You were judged as an artist during the Renaissance age as how closely you could mimic nature. We also have an association between Giotto and Cimabue because this was Giotto's teacher. And this is what that altarpiece looks like in real life. It is a little bit larger than 10 feet, and you can kind of see the standard doorway there off to the right. So these paintings are rather massive in size. Now, the best remaining works of Giotto are in the Arena Chapel in Padua. The Arena Chapel is called the Arena Chapel because this is built on the grounds of a basically Roman arena that was demolished. And this is the inside of the building. We have the lives of Christ displayed, the lives of Mary, and we also have the 7 vices and 7 virtues. So here we are at the entrance looking toward the altar. And here we are at the altar looking toward the entrance. And above the entrance door is the Last Judgment. So a couple of the works we'll look at. We'll start with the meeting of Joachim and Anna. And this painting is so unique and so different from what's been happening during the Gothic and medieval time periods, mainly because we have characters that interact, characters that show emotion. And you could have, during the Gothic age, characters just standing right next to one another, kind of like those angels in Cimabue's altarpiece, where they're just kind of looking out and around. They're not engaging with each other, even if they're standing next to one another. So here we have engagement, we have emotion being shown, and it's really a very cool image and definitely a step forward in terms of the evolution of art. There are issues, though. The architecture looks a little bit silly. It's still a rather flat scene. We haven't figured out linear perspective yet. Everything is equally bathed in light. We don't have a standard light source. We don't have these figures casting shadows or anything like that. Some other images, such as Adoration of the Magi, is really cool. It's one of my favorites because that Star of Bethlehem up above is a rendering of Halley's Comet that is passing the Earth in 1305. We have the Crucifixion and the Lamentation, and then the Last Judgment. And I also chose a detail from the Last Judgment because it's important. You can see in the image at the left, everyone is perfectly lined up. It's very symmetrical. Christ is in the center, surrounded by a full body halo called a mandorla. At Christ's right, we have the saved. At Christ's left, we have the damned and an image of hell. Below the cross, and that's what we have at the detail to the right, we have, on the saved side, is Enrico Scrovini, who is the person who built the Arena Chapel, who commissioned Giotto to paint the inside, offering the Virgin Mary this chapel. And basically he's doing so to atone for the sins he committed earlier in life. So during the Renaissance, it was very common for the patron, the person paying for the work of art, to be in the painting itself. And it was also okay to kind of have your sins absolved by doing some religious act, such as building a chapel. So now let's take a look at who is paying for art to be produced during the Renaissance. So these are going to be the patrons. They're going to be, first of all, the wealthy families. And this is going to include Enrico Scrovini, the Albizzi family, the Strazzis, the Brancaccis, and most importantly for us is going to be the Medici family. We also have the church that commissions a lot of art. These include works from popes such as Benedict XII, Clement VI, Innocent VII, Leo X, who happens to be a member of the Medici family, but most importantly, Julius II, who we see off to the right there. He is the pope that reigns over the High Renaissance and commissions work by people such as Michelangelo and Raphael. We also have the guilds, which are independent associations of bankers, merchants, artisans, and manufacturers. Basically, whatever job that you had in Italy during this time, you had a guild that you worked for. Similar in design to today's labor unions, but they were also extremely competitive amongst one another. And finally, civic bodies. They're not going to commission art as frequently as other patrons do, but for instance, the statue of David by Michelangelo, that was commissioned by the city of Florence since David is its patron saint. The original location for the statue of David, it was located right outside the Palazzo Vecchio that you see at the right. This is the seat of government in Florence. So now let's move from the early Renaissance to the middle Renaissance. And the early Renaissance, this is where we emerged out of the Dark Ages into this new style of art, this new sensibility. And now the Middle Renaissance is where all those technical aspects of art come together. We're also shifting location. So instead of being in Padua, we moved down into about midway through Italy, and this is Florence. During the 15th century, the city of Florence was the place to be. And it must have been similar to what Paris would have been like in the late 19th century, or what New York would have been in the early 20th century. Basically, if it was happening in Florence. But there's still some problems. Attacks on Florence came from the neighboring city-states of both Milan and Naples. In 1417, the plague strikes again. In fact, it strikes while Milan is attacking the city, and it wipes out the Milanese army. But also 16,000 Florentines are going to die. Taxes become an issue in 1420, and I'll show you an artwork that deals specifically with taxation. Halley's Comet is passing the Earth again in 1453, but this time it's associated with major earthquakes, and it causes widespread panic. It freaks so many people out. Because of the earthquakes, they're sleeping outside their homes at night. But we do have some good news. In 1454, the Medici family comes to power and are able to provide a relative calm until they are exiled again in 1494. There is definitely a love and hate relationship between the Medici family and the city of Florence. If you get the chance, there is an excellent PBS series that you can find on YouTube called The Medici Godfathers of the Renaissance. I definitely suggest at least watching the first segment of that. So the family is important to us because they are tremendous patrons of the arts. And we're going to look first at the Florence Cathedral. And back in the 1400s, it did not have a dome. This is actually a Gothic structure. It was built in 1296 by Arnolfo da Cambio. But it was an overly ambitious project, and they wanted to make the largest dome in the Western world, which up to that time was the Pantheon. The Pantheon is 140 feet in diameter. The Florence Cathedral is about 143.5 feet in diameter. But since the fall of Rome, no one could remember how to create concrete, which is what the Pantheon is made out of. So this structure had to be formed in some other way, and no one could figure out how to do it. The space was just too wide. And here's a little cross-section of it. What ended up happening is the artist or architect Filippo Brunelleschi, because he started off as a sculptor and then went to Rome and studied the ancient ruins of the Roman Empire. He came back to Florence with this newfound ideas of architecture, and he developed this building technique where the dome could be built without any support mechanism. So there was no scaffolding on the inside or outside of the dome, but also with this dome, he actually made two of them. One is a smaller interior dome, and then you have a walkway, and then you have the visible exterior dome. So with all that empty space for not only a staircase to go up for maintenance, but also it alleviated the weight of this building, so it was able to be created. And here is the Roman Pantheon. And that's the dome they were trying to beat in terms of diameter. Here's the walkway up through between the two domes of the Florence Cathedral. And it costs you €8 to do so. You can go up every single day except on Sunday. And it has an absolutely amazing view from the top. Do not slide down. If you're a fan of Assassin's Creed, your character can slide down the dome, but it will die. So make sure you save your game before you do that. The bell tower that you see to the left, that was a bell tower designed by Giotto, the one who made that altarpiece of the enthroned Madonna and Child. Filippo Brunelleschi is buried at the Florence Cathedral. His remains were found in 1978. We had no idea where he was, but when the catacombs underneath the cathedral were being reconstructed, that's where they found his remains, and he has been reburied there. He was also famous for creating this building, the Hospital of the Innocents, or in Italian it's Ospedale degli Innocenti. And this is not a hospital in terms of treating sick people. This was an orphanage. But it was such a unique building because this is a Roman building created from the ideas of the ancient Roman ruins that Brunelleschi saw. And we have the famous Corinthian columns, the arches, which the Romans invented. We have the little triangles over the windows. Those are called pediments. This is also a building that was the first building made with a blueprint. And the reason there was a blueprint left for the construction crew was because Brunelleschi, for the most part, was across town working on the dome of the Florence Cathedral. Also, the dome on the cathedral was funded by the Medici family. And so during the time in Florence, if you were an orphan, this is where you would be taken. And you would have, of course, free home, food, vocational training until the age of 18, but you would also assume the last name of Innocenti. And you can find a lot of people in Italy today that have this last name that can trace their lineage back to this orphanage. These infant medallions display the children that were innocently massacred by King Herod. These are by a different artist, and they were created later. The sculpture of David by Donatello is one of the most important sculptures in all of Italian Renaissance art. This is the first time in 1,000 years, so since the fall of the Roman Empire, we have a bronze, male, nude, full-scale sculpture in the round. And Donatello is the artist. Now, Donatello was a really strange character. This is also a time period where most people died around the age of 40. Well, Donatello lives into his 80s. But he was also very relatable to his work in terms of he took it very personally. If someone gave him a bad review about some artwork that he was creating, he would go home and destroy it. He was also caught talking to his creations. In fact, there's this one work called Zucconi, and he was caught screaming at it, saying, "Speak, damn you, speak." He was a very good friend of the Medici family, and they are the ones that commissioned this bronze sculpture. This was also a private commission. It was not put on public display anywhere. It's a totally different version of the idea of David from the story in the Bible. It's a much more feminine style. Long hair, curly hair, bonnet, laurel leaves around the bonnet, which are an indication of the Medici family. The figure itself is only 5'2" tall, and we really wouldn't probably put our money on this David compared to that by Michelangelo in terms of being able to beat Goliath. But this is also a story, a different part of the story than we see with Michelangelo's version, because here the battle has already taken place, and David here hasn't even broken a sweat. You see Goliath's severed head underneath David's foot. In fact, he's running his toes through his beard. We're not exactly sure when this sculpture was created because it was a private commission, and it ends up showing up on an inventory list of the Medici family's artworks, and this had been placed in their courtyard. And again, much different version than what we have from the statue of David by Michelangelo. And we'll cover that one in a few moments when we talk about Michelangelo. So this is also where we have the idea of piercing the pictorial plane. That in 1435, Leon Battista Alberti publishes his book on painting, and he states that looking at a painting should be the same as looking out a window. This is where we get Filippo Brunelleschi, again, after he has just completed the dome on the Florence Cathedral, the Hospital of the Innocents. In his spare time, he figures out linear perspective. And here is the Santa Maria del Carmine, and this is the back of the church. This is where you would enter. Churches of this time are cross-shaped, so we're entering basically the bottom of the cross and walking up through the congregation. And at the crossing of the church, this is where the wealthier families would have private chapels. Now, if you were very, very wealthy like the Medici, your chapel would be at home because churches really weren't that safe. There were many times where people would be assassinated in a church. So with the Brancacci Chapel, on the upper left-hand side of this image, and these are all fresco paintings, this is a work by Masaccio. And Masaccio was the one who did the Holy Trinity, the first work done in linear perspective. This is the best collection of his surviving works right here. And we're interested in the top work, which is called the Tribute Money. The Tribute Money is a rarely remembered story from the Bible. It's where Christ and the apostles arrive in the city of Capernaum. They're confronted by a Roman tax gatherer who demands a half drachma tribute. They do not have any money, so Christ directs Peter to the Lake of Galilee to get the coin out of the fish's mouth. And then we have also Peter paying the tax collector. Now, this work, compared to Giotto's, is a completely different type of composition. Giotto's work is very much associated with early Renaissance art, or emerging from the Dark Ages. By the time we get to Masaccio, this is where we have all the technical skills pretty well down. We have linear perspective in this painting, which with the building off to the right. We have the idea of chiaroscuro, the modeling of those figures to make them look three-dimensional. And that's also a work that deals with specifically taxation of the clergy. Also during the 1400s, this is where we have amplified perspective or foreshortening. And of course, Mantegna was the most famous artist to use that. This is where we start to move away from using panels to paint, and we start to utilize canvas. The Birth of Venus here is the very first time we have a painting on a piece of canvas. The reason it's on canvas is because it was going to be a flag or a banner for a processional. We also have the invention of oil paint. Oil paint is not invented in Italy. It is invented in Northern Europe. The Arnolfini portrait we saw earlier in the semester, that is a work that is one of the first ones done in oil. Jan van Eyck and his brother helped to create the chemical composition of oil paint. And of course, they also completed the Ghent altarpiece together. We're not exactly sure who did what on this work. A lot of arguments say that Jan was the one who painted the imagery and then his brother created the frame. But again, a work we've talked about throughout this semester, especially during the art theft lecture. So now we're going to move into the final segment of the Renaissance, which is called the Late or the High Renaissance. And this takes place during the 1500s. And this particular block of time, and I know I mentioned earlier on, when we look at the Renaissance, we look at it through the centuries, the 1300s, the early Renaissance, the 1400s, the middle Renaissance. Well, now with the 1500s, we're looking at a very truncated time period. We actually start around 1495, because this is when Leonardo da Vinci begins the Last Supper painting. In 1527, we generally say that the Renaissance, at least in Rome, ends, because this is the time period of the sack of Rome. And then we have some more emergence of some artists up in the city of Venice. But this is also a time period where we're most comfortable, because this is where the best known works are produced. The Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, the Statue of David, and they're being produced by the leading artists of the era. such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. So with the later High Renaissance, we also have individuals such as Machiavelli, who was expelled from public life when the Medici returned to power in 1512. He writes the famous book that's still in print today called The Prince, in hopes of gaining their favor and returning to politics. But instead, the Medici accuse him of conspiracy and have him imprisoned. And as I just mentioned, the sack of Rome is an event that occurs in 1527. Led by the troops of Charles V, it has been called a 6-month orgy of killing, looting, and burning. During that time, over 10,000 people are killed, and Rome's population declines by 80%. We also have our very first art historical book written. In 1550, Giorgio Vasari writes The Lives of the Artists, and this is a book that's still in print today, and it's a book I highly recommend reading. It is considered the first survey of Italian art history. It's all biographical. It begins with Cimabue and Giotto, and it moves through Donatello. Vasari considers the time period that we're in at this time, the 1500s, to be the apex of artistic achievement. And he happens to be right. Vasari's best friend happens to be Michelangelo. And so 1/4 of the book, and it's a pretty extensive book, is on Michelangelo. We're also looking at a different city. During the 1400s, we were in Florence, and now in the 1500s, all these artists are being called to Rome. The Vatican is what takes center stage. There's a major rebuilding project led by Pope Julius II. And we'll begin our discussion of these artists with Leonardo da Vinci, since he is the most popular. And he's got this great quote. He says, "Art is never finished, only abandoned." And I think that's really true, especially for this artist. He was someone who moved constantly from project to project, rarely finishing any work of art. When we look at famous artists throughout history, such as Vincent van Gogh, this is an artist who created 1,700 works. When we look at Picasso, 15,000 works. Leonardo da Vinci, about 20. That's it. Now, Leonardo da Vinci was taught by the artist Verrocchio, who was mostly a sculptor, and so also taught da Vinci how to do bronze sculptures. But for the most part, what we have left from da Vinci is paintings that he works on. The painting at the right is the Baptism of Christ. This is the very first work that da Vinci helps Verrocchio complete. And da Vinci completes the 2 angels that are off to the left-hand side of this painting. So in 1494, 1495, we have the Last Supper beginning. So we're a little unsure about the start date, just simply because when the commission was given is a little bit different than when he actually put a brush to this wall. Now, this is a painting we all know, we all love. It invades our subconscious on a nuclear level. We're all familiar with this painting. Even Andy Warhol said that his family had an image of this painting in their family kitchen. Unfortunately, Andy never saw the Last Supper in person. During his time in Italy, it was under restoration, which you see here. The restoration took about 20 years, from 1977 to 1997. It is as good as it is ever going to be. Unfortunately, only about 20% of the original paint remains. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the struggles that this painting has gone through. We lampoon it in The Simpsons, whereas the bread and blood of Christ become peanuts and beer. We also have the Last Supper casket, which you can be buried in from Peninsular Caskets, runs about $2,500. or you can subject yourself to around 15 hours of needles. So a lot of people think that the Last Supper is in Rome. It is not. It is up in Milan. In fact, it was commissioned by the Duke of Milan, and it's in the Santa Maria delle Grazie. And this is the refectory where the monks would take their meals. And this is also where the Duke of Milan would sometimes go to have dinner with them. Now, Leonardo began painting in late 1494 or early 1495, and he was 42 years old. And this is a big deal because, as I had mentioned previously, the life expectancy of someone during the Renaissance was around 40. Raphael, one of the painters we're going to discuss shortly, died at the age of 36. Domenico Ghirlandaio, the teacher of Michelangelo, died at 45. So if Da Vinci died at 40, we wouldn't be talking about him at all today. He wasn't even considered one of the best painters in Italy. In 1492, if you created a top 10 list, number 1 would be Pietro Perugino. This artist is the one who led the dream team of painters who painted the walls of the Sistine Chapel. His most famous work is Christ here conferring the keys of the church to St. Peter. And of course, St. Peter is considered Pope number 1. The next artist is Pinturicchio, and he assisted also in the walls of the Sistine Chapel, but did a lot of work for Pope Alexander VI. As far as the third best painter, there was really everyone else. Again, Leonardo hadn't been known at this time. He hadn't completed any notable public works. He abandoned many of the works that would have given him fame, but he also had other interests. Art was further down on the list for him. One of the few works he did complete, Cecilia Gallerani, which is more commonly known as The Lady with the Ermine. This is a work that was held by a private collector. It was not seen by the public. Da Vinci's other interests included geometry, architecture, anatomy, fortifications, and implements of war. And we have a copy of his resume that he sent the Duke of Milan. And it mostly talks about how he was a civil engineer, that he had methods of blowing up fortresses. He knew how to create underground tunnels so he could burrow underneath moats. He could also make fire-throwing engines of both practical and beautiful design, such as this one here. And you can see the scale of this crossbow compared to the person that's just off to the right. It's only at the end of the resume where he says that I can carry out sculpture in marble, bronze, and clay, and in painting I can do any kind of work, as well as any man, whoever he may be. But of course, that's kind of a lie. He fudges his qualifications and exaggerates his abilities. And this is something we still see on today's resumes, right? So Da Vinci wasn't unlike any of us. The problem was, and the gap in his education, was that he was never trained in fresco painting. He was trained primarily as a bronze sculptor, and he could also do oil painting. The Duke hired him to create what was going to be called the Sforza horse. And this work never got completed. If it had been, this would have put Leonardo da Vinci in the history books immediately. This would have been the largest equestrian monument that anyone ever created during the Renaissance age. Unfortunately, though, the Duke was very much a warlord, and he loved to go into battle. And he started a war, and the bronze that was going to be used to create this horse ended up getting reapportioned to make cannons. And Da Vinci lost the commission. In return for losing the commission, he was commissioned to do the Last Supper painting. So it was kind of a reconciliation prize. The Sforza horse was completed. There are 2 copies. One is in the Hippodrome in Milan, and I believe the other one is in Paris by the contemporary artist Nina Acamo. And this is what the Sforza horse preliminary drawings look like by Da Vinci. So that leaves us with the Last Supper. So again, this is not a fresco painting. Had it been a fresco painting, it would have been as beautiful as the Sistine ceiling or walls are today. However, this is basically a 15-foot by 30-foot oil painting. And that's also one of the reasons it is in such a horrible shape today. On the back side of that wall is the kitchen. And the ovens were near this wall. And the heating and cooling of the wall, because of the ovens, caused premature paint peeling. So even within 20 years of its original completion, it started to flake off pieces of paint. We can also see at the very base, below the image of Christ, we have a top of a doorway. The monks decided that it was taking too long to get the food from the kitchen into the room where they were eating, so they made a doorway right through the Last Supper. This is also a room that Napoleon housed his horses in during his campaigns in Italy. And it went through a whole bunch of cleaning throughout the centuries, probably doing more damage than good. One of the times that it was cleaned during the 1600s, they used Greek wine that was soaked up in bread to clean it. So again, you can see how faded and ghostly these images are. We are lucky to have it at all today, as a bomb narrowly missed it during World War II. Luckily, there were sandbags placed in front of the image. An image absolutely in linear perspective, and of course, very geometric. So the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci, probably the most famous painting in the world and definitely the icon of Western art history. But it sounds kind of funny that she wasn't really that famous until she was stolen in 1911. And there she is today behind bulletproof glass. And if you've ever seen her, you will note that not only is the painting fairly small, but there are huge crowds trying to get a picture of her. Why is she so famous? Because I never got it either. I didn't like the painting that much, but the idea is the technical advancement of portraiture. During the Renaissance, this is the way your portrait would be painted, completely in profile. And the Mona Lisa is in what's called a three-quarter view. So not only do we get her shoulders, we can get a little bit more of her body. She's facing us, engaging us when she's looking toward us. The nondescript landscape in the back, and we do know that the panel that she was painted on was also cut down from its original size. So we're not sure really what was off in the margins. What's unique about this painting for me is that Da Vinci never kept any notes on the Mona Lisa. And this is a person who was an avid note taker. We also have to consider that this is a painting that he never parted with, which is kind of interesting. The Mona Lisa is supposed to be a painting of a Florentine banker's wife, Lisa Giordini Giocondo. And normally during this time, the patron, the banker, is paying Leonardo da Vinci to paint this work. But it never got given to the patron. Da Vinci holds on to it for his entire life, and about 5 years before his death, somewhere around 1514, he sells it to the King of France, and then goes and lives in the court of King Francis I for the last 5 years of his life. He's going to pass away in France in 1519. As you heard in the art theft lecture, it was stolen in 1911, and it was found in 1913, or it was recovered, I should say, when Vincenzo Perugia tries to sell it to an undercover police officer. We used to think Isabella d'Este was the model for the Mona Lisa, but she is not. This is one of the unfinished works by Leonardo da Vinci. Isabella d'Este was one of the most famous women in Italy and also one of the most wealthiest. She posed for a painting by da Vinci, and 2 years later she sends one of her assistants to go see what the status is on her painting, and the assistant came back and basically said, "You're never going to see the painting completed." He's not interested in working on his commissions. He's basically walking around a workshop teaching other students how to paint. So let's move on to the artist Raphael, who's probably the least known of the three major artists of the Renaissance, but he is very famous for producing these Madonna images. And this is unlike any other type of Madonna we've seen up to this point. Not at all like the way Giotto creates the Madonna and Child enthroned. It's much more like a tender image by Mary Cassatt between the mother and her child. The only way that we really know the image at the left is of a religious figure is we have that slight halo above the head of the Madonna. And we also have a church in the background, which is the Church of San Bernardino, which is located in Tuscany. This is another Madonna image by Raphael, and I just put this up here to show you what 500 years of dirt looks like. Now, early on in this painting's history, it was damaged horrifically. It was in a building that collapsed because of an earthquake, and it was shattered into 17 different pieces. It was painted on wood. And then in 2007, it was cleaned. And so you can see how absolutely bright and beautiful this work is. Pope Julius II calls Raphael from Florence down to Rome to have him paint his personal apartments. And this is particularly the library, where each wall was going to be a domain of knowledge. And we have poetry on one of the walls, law, religion, and philosophy. So the other name for philosophy is the School of Athens. That's where you commonly see it named. This is a grouping of the most famous philosophers, mathematicians, astronomers, naturalists throughout the history of the world. Right at the center of the painting, you have Plato and Aristotle walking toward us. At their feet on the steps is Socrates. Off to the right, holding a globe, that's Ptolemy, the astronomer. Off to the left, writing in a book, that's Pythagoras. Right above him, strolling from left to right, Alexander the Great. Now, Raphael was also a really cool person. He worked for 3 different popes. He was very popular with the ladies. And he also had a really close-knit group of friends that were artists. He was friends with Leonardo da Vinci. And when you look at Plato there at the very center walking toward us, he's on the left, that is a painting, facial features of Leonardo da Vinci. The astronomer Ptolemy, that is the architect Bramante, who is rebuilding St. Peter's Cathedral, and that's the architecture you see in the background of this painting. Now that person that is kind of leaning on the block of marble at the very front of the painting, just off center to the left, is Michelangelo. Michelangelo and Raphael were not friends, but they worked within 20 feet of one another at the same time, because one of the passageways out of the library leads you into the Sistine Chapel. And Michelangelo is painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel while Raphael is painting the School of Athens. Now, the story goes that Michelangelo left one day. Raphael snuck over and saw what Michelangelo was painting. He had just completed an angel in the pose of what you see Michelangelo in right now. Raphael runs back, paints Michelangelo, has him leaning on a block of marble, and allegedly the next day invites Michelangelo over to see his work, and Michelangelo, of course, gets really upset. Michelangelo was much more of a solitary figure. He was someone who was very moody as well. And it's unique because that image of Michelangelo, and why we believe the story is true, is because it's not on any of the preliminary drawings for this painting. And Raphael is in the painting as well, just off to the right, sneaking in. And this is only one of 3 times where he does a self-portrait. Raphael is so popular that upon his death in 1520, he is given a state funeral and his grave is in the Pantheon. And that leaves us with Michelangelo. So Michelangelo, as a kid of about 12, would go over to the Brancacci Chapel in Florence and copy the works of Masaccio, which of course you see the tribute money here at the bottom. He would then join the workshop of Ghirlandaio, who we've seen his Last Supper painting many times over the semester. And unfortunately, Michelangelo was not impressed by Ghirlandaio. In fact, he said, "I learned nothing working for him or having him teach me." It's kind of a harsh statement to make because he definitely taught him how to do fresco painting, which of course we'll see on the Sistine ceiling. At 25, he completes his first major sculptural project, the Pietà. And we also have the statue of David about 4 years later. If you've never seen the statue of David in person, it is absolutely gigantic, over 17 feet high and up on a 6-foot pedestal. The planned location for that sculpture was on top of the Florence Cathedral. However, when it was unveiled, the city founders and those that commissioned it thought it was so beautiful that they put it out front of the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of government. And of course, today there is a replica, the original sculpture seen on an earlier picture is in the Academy. A wonderful juxtaposition between Michelangelo and Donatello. Again, Donatello is a Middle Renaissance artist, and Michelangelo is a late or a high Renaissance artist. And Michelangelo's version is a much older David and also a different part of the story. But the medium itself is different as well, marble instead of bronze. And when we look back at bronze, we can consider it, if it was the same size sculpture, bronze is 10 times more expensive to create than working with marble. But even though he was noted for a lot of his sculptural works, Pope Julius II brought him to the Vatican to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And this is the Sistine Chapel here. It is not very showy. It is just off of St. Peter's Cathedral, and it is basically a fortification. This has walls thick enough to withstand cannon fire. It has areas for archers up above. It has little drop points around where you could drop hot oil onto the enemy if it was attacking. It is made for fortification. And of course, here is the famed ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. We talked about the walls earlier. They were done during the late 1400s, and artists such as Perugino and Pinturicchio worked on those. This is what the ceiling looked like before Michelangelo started. It was supposed to emulate heaven. And the finished work, these are scenes from the book of Genesis. They start off to the left over the altar and finish out at the entrance door. Michelangelo absolutely hated painting the Sistine Chapel. He quit one time, went back to Florence, and agents of the Pope brought him back to the Vatican to finish the work. During the entire 4 years, from 1508 to 1512, when he completed it, he complained every day, wrote songs, wrote letters to his friends saying how much he hated this job, and basically saying he was a painter or a sculptor, not a painter. So we'll look at some of these individual images. Separation of light and darkness is our first image. The creation of the sun, moon, and planets. Separation of land from water. The center scene, and probably the most famous, the creation of Adam, followed by the creation of Eve, temptation and expulsion, and the last three images are about Noah. We have the sacrifice, the deluge, and note how Noah's Ark is exactly the same as the Sistine Chapel, again letting you know that the church is the way to salvation. And then we have the drunkenness of Noah. We have the sack of Rome, and the last vestiges of the Renaissance occur in Venice. I just want to touch on a few works. The Tempest by Giorgione. We have kind of a nondescript painting. We don't really know the narrative or story. If there was one, it has been lost centuries ago. We just have, in fact, when it was sold at auction in the 1700s, they just defined it as a painting with a landscape, gypsy woman, and soldier. We do have some incomplete architecture just to the right of the soldier. And when it was x-rayed, the soldier was added later over another figure of a female. Now, Giorgione is famous also for this painting, Sleeping Venus, which is the basis of his student's painting, The Venus of Urbino. And Titian, probably, arguably, the fourth great Renaissance artist, was a student of Giorgione, and the Venus of Urbino is going to be the basis for Manet's Olympia, which we will see in 1863 to 1865. This is how large the painting is in person. And we also saw Titian's work with the Assumption and Consecration of the Virgin earlier on in the semester when we talked about implied line. Berenice's Feast in the House of Levi. And I also want to take a moment to talk about mannerism. So when we look at Renaissance art, for the most part, it can be defined as being normal, classical, and ideal. Spaces are clearly defined and measured. Scenes tend to be harmonious, integrated, and balanced. Figures graceful, poised, and suggest the possibility of movement. All art that does not fit this definition is mannerist, which is why it's tough to come up with a definition. But this is a general definition I'm going to give you. Mannerist art can include manipulations and distortions of the formal elements, line, space, and color. The figures can have elongated proportions, exaggerated poses, enigmatic gestures. And the imagery can be obscure, unsettling, and oftentimes erotic. So what happens with mannerism is that it used to be taught as an entirely separate kind of like art movement. Around the end of Renaissance, we'd have some mannerism, and then we'd go into the Baroque in the 1600s. But now we see that mannerism runs concurrently with the Renaissance. And if it wasn't perfect and ideal, it would just be labeled as mannerist. The most famous mannerist work is the Madonna of the Long Neck. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video for just a minute or two and write down all the things that are odd about this painting, because this is a Madonna and Child enthroned painting. So go ahead and pause the video and write down your ideas, and we'll come right back. All right, so how many of these things did you get? When we look at the Madonna of the Long Neck, we have to say that the child is kind of strange. It's not engaging us at all. The child looks as if it's asleep. The child is also gigantic. And the child even could be looking as if it's dead. The painting itself looks more like a Pietà. Mary mourning over the body of Christ rather than a Madonna and child image. The Madonna's neck and fingers are attenuated, hence the name the Madonna of the long neck. We have the Madonna that's wearing jewelry. We also have this group of graces off to the left. Normally we have angels. We have St. Jerome in the bottom right-hand side of that image reading from a scroll, so you can definitely say linear perspective is not at play here. It's, in fact, a very bad manipulation of scale. And we have columns that look more like smokestacks. They just kind of go up and just aren't holding up anything. And we also have a Madonna in a half-sitting, half-standing position. So it is, we're not really sure what she's sitting on or if she's standing. What I wanted to point out here is Giotto's Last Judgment off to the left is perfectly symmetrical. Everything is perfectly Renaissance. But Michelangelo's version of the Last Judgment, which we also find in the Sistine Chapel, is Mannerist, which is kind of unique because Michelangelo is the pinnacle of all Renaissance artists, but toward the end of his career, he starts doing some Mannerist work. This is painted also 25 years later than the Sistine ceiling. It's a very unique image when we have Christ at the center. He's not really surrounded by a mandorla. He's kind of just got this glow behind him. We've also don't know whether he's giving a blessing or he's like giving a curse, whether he's happy or angry. We have figures of all different sizes throughout this work. We have some that are being raised up to heaven, some that are being brought down to hell. We have in the land here in the bottom left-hand side of the image, we have the dead rising from the grave. Some are skeletons, some are in corpses of various stages of decomposition. We have that person bringing everyone across on a boat and then hitting them out of the boat with a paddle or oar. So it's a very disturbing work and definitely Mannerist in style. And this is where we're going to end our talk on the Renaissance.